Unit 5, Turkey, China, Russia, and the West, also known as Society at Crossroads, How to Deal with Modernization. Here are the big ideas. This is ranging from the 1750s to the 1900s, so we're getting into more modern history, and certain countries are deciding whether or not they should westernize. Remember that the Ottomans are from Turkey. You have the Chinese, the Russians, and the Japanese. Out of all four civilizations, make sure that you know that Japan will be the strongest one in regards to modernizing, and this is a reason why Japan will also be a strong contender for World War I and World War II. The Ottomans are going to deal with a lot of diversity. The Chinese are going to deal with their own people and in many internal problems. The Russians are going to have some external threats as well as internal and face some really humiliating defeats. As you look at this political cartoon, there's a nickname for the Ottoman Empire. They're called the sick men of Europe. And they're deciding whether or not they want to modernize and westernize. You will see them in World War I, but they'll also be known as the sick man of Europe. In this particular slide, you can see this is regarding the Ottoman Empire. One of the things that they really struggled with were a lot of problems on the battlefield. Since they chose not to modernize or westernize, a lot of their swords could not compete against these new types of guns. And remember, this was all about cultural insularity, where they wanted to focus on their own culture and they wanted to pride themselves in what they had, but they were not able to keep up against Western powers. At this time, the Janissaries, if you remember, Janissaries were some of the boys that were taken from Christian territories and forced to convert to Islam. Throughout all these time periods, you're going to see that they are focusing on becoming really strong military, and so they'll stage what's called coups. And coups are when you go ahead and do kind of like a hostile takeover for the government. In this case, they took over the palaces and they started to become really laxed in terms of what policies were taking place. Around the same time that the Russians were gathering lands, you'll also see that the Ottomans did the same thing. Remember, they took down the Byzantine Empire, and they'll take lots of territories, places like Egypt and Greece. And during this time, you're going to see that they're going to have a very difficult time trying to keep attention of all the different types of lands that they took. So they're going to experience a lot of territorial loss. With cultural insularity, when the country just focuses on their own culture, they decided to not really pay attention to westernizing or modernizing, of course. So they became very dependent on European goods, and because of that, the Europeans became more powerful. The Ottomans will start to lose their money. And in regards to trade, that's where they'll also start to decline. Capitulations were created because the Ottomans could not pay back their loans to the Europeans, and so this allowed for more Europeans to come into Turkey, and they were not subject to any type of Turkish law. So again, if you were a Turkish person, you would be super upset in regards to foreigners coming into your own country and not abiding by the rules. And especially being an Islamic area, you could see how this would become a problem. One particular example would be a foreign woman coming in with her husband and not wearing a hijab, for example. And at the same time, too, you're going to see more European countries coming into Turkey, and this is going to just bring more incursions into the area of Turkey and make it more difficult for the Ottomans to manage their own affairs. Like the Counter-Reformation and how the Catholic Church had to reform itself with the Protestant Reformation, you see the same type of thing happening here with the Ottoman Empire. Mahmud II steps in, brings in things like science, military academy information, wants to really create a solid westernized base inside Turkey. Unfortunately, you're going to have some conflicts. The Janissaries, which were powerful military that were Islamic, are going to have a clash with Mahmud II, make it much more difficult. At this time, telegraphs, railroad lines, things like getting rid of military land grants are going to start to take place because back in the day, military families like the Janissaries were favored. You also see a major restructuring called the Tanzimat. This is really important. Make sure that you understand this for testing purposes. Tanzimat refers to reorganization. It's inspired by Enlightenment ideals that we saw with the French and American Revolution and Haitian. And the idea of the Enlightenment is to bring more rights to people and to look at powerful institutions and to change kind of that power struggle that existed before. So you can see equality before the law is a kind of a big battle cry here, to create civil codes amongst people in society and how to kind of follow them. And then at the same time even look at things like economic with like the military and even like things like maritime, like the Navy and stuff like that as well. Of course, opposition is going to take place within a really strongly Islamic society. So you have some younger people coming up in terms of called the young Ottomans and the young Turks. They will start to resist against the government for the time. You'll see that some of them will be formally trained in Paris, especially the young Turks. They will fight for things like suffrage, which is voting, equality before the law, free public education, and really strive and push for this new modern era in Turkish society. Anytime you bring in the idea of secularization, so non-religious, especially in an Islamic area, you're going to have push. And so in this particular case, there's going to be a lot of resistance. And so Turkey is obviously going to take a very long time trying to westernize and modernize. And you can still see today in some of these Islamic areas, it's still a battle that they struggle with today. So let's look at the Chinese. They're going to have a new dynasty called the Qing. They are ethnically not Chinese. They are Manchu people. So they're foreign people ruling China now. They're deciding that they have everything that they could ever have, and they do not want to modernize. So anything that the Europeans bring in, they kind of chuckle or laugh at. But again, the British are insisting. They keep trying to trade with the Chinese on limited days that they do trade. And the British have tried very hard to woo them with all kinds of different products, but nothing impresses the Chinese until opium comes into play. Opium is a drug, and it is taken from poppies, and in this particular case, it is equivalent to heroin. What's going to happen is the British have colonized the area of India. They're going to get the poppies from there and turn them into opium, and the Chinese will definitely get addicted to it. You'll have almost about 12 million addicts because of this particular exchange. One of the Chinese officials by the name of Lin Zhejiu, make sure you know this guy, he's a Chinese government official, says you need to stop this trade of opium. It's causing major problems in China. So during this time, he does write to Queen Victoria to try to stop the trade and tries to convince her to get rid of it because the British know that opium is illegal in England. The Queen will not respond whatsoever. Since the Chinese are resisting to the British during this time, the British start to get a little annoyed. They are going to bring in steam-powered gunboats, and it's going to go up against an outdated Chinese navy. And, of course, the British are going to win this particular opium war. So, because of this, a treaty is drafted up called the Treaty of Nanjing. It forces 5 Chinese ports to open up for trading purposes and also gives Hong Kong to England, which is why there's a strong British influence in Hong Kong. The big idea to remember here is something called extraterritoriality rights, and this is the important idea for this slide. It's the fact that if you are a foreigner, you are not subject to Chinese law. So this was similar to the capitulations that we talked about in the Ottoman Empire. Again, this is going to upset native Chinese people because you can come into a society, follow your own set of rules in England, and not even have to obey Chinese laws. And so, of course, this is going to make only the native people of Chinese angry, and it's going to cause problems within China internally. So the internal problems in China are really great. The Taiping Rebellion is one of the first things to see a major weakness in China. You're going to see that the Chinese people are suffering from land problems, very similar to what the Romans experienced in Han China as well. A guy by the name of Hong Zhiquan pushes for several things in China, such as the abolition of private property, more free public education, communal wealth that can be distributed, and even ending the practice of foot binding. So there's kind of a push to modernize, but at the same time, just help the Chinese people. In the course of any type of rebellion or protest, you're going to see that it's going to affect things inside the society. For example, police having to come and stop the incursions from happening. And so about this time, you'll see 20 million people dying, which is a catastrophe. You have a new empress. Her name is Empress Dowager Cixi. She wants to modernize China, but doesn't really do a good job of doing this. And she'll definitely look at the issues of factories, gunboats, as well as creating ammunition. But the thing is, she's going to take a lot of that money and she's going to spend it on herself. And she ends up spending a lot of the money towards a marble boat palace that you can still visit in China today. Why? So that she could have a nice, cool place to relax in the summertime. And of course, this is very similar to what you see with Louis XVI and his wife spending tons of money on Versailles and parties and things like that. Then to add on top of more problems, you see a type of a group start to form called the Boxers. They formed a group called the Society of Harmonious Fists. And what they're going to do is anybody who is foreign, they're going to put their hatred on them. So again, they'll yell out things like death to foreign devils. And because of this, there were some foreigners that were killed. And of course, multinational forces are going to come in along with the Chinese government to execute and kill them. Secretly, though, the Empress Dowager Cixi was really kind of for it because she was starting to also hate the foreigners. But again, eventually, towards the end of that particular rebellion, they will execute them in public. And she will decide to actually send people to study abroad. She'll look for modernizing China. But because of all these losses of life and disruption in the government and the draining of the economy, you're going to see that China is not going to be able to really make anything for themselves until like the 1900s, where they're still going to struggle, and you'll hear about all the different types of things that they try. On the left-hand side is Empress Dowager Cixi. You can see the Boxers in the middle, and on the right, an opium den, bottom right, marble palace. Russia is also dealing with issues of multiculturalism. Having such a large territory, they had to deal with all kinds of different ethnicities, and so it was very challenging for them. You'll see that the Crimean War was a very devastating loss for the Russians, and it exposes major military weakness. It shows the Russians that they have to westernize and modernize. Another major thing that the Russians needed to work on was how most of Russian people were serfs. They were tied to the land, focused on agriculture. In order to modernize Russia, Alexander II, who's a Romanov, decided that they needed to emancipate the serfs, which means to free them. By doing this, this would allow for more serfs to go into the workforce, and you'll see a lot of those serfs will not actually escape bad treatment, but instead what will end up happening is they'll go into factories and experience bad treatment there. With all the drastic change that was taking place in Russian society, it made sense that the government had to have a response, and they created local district assemblies called zemstvos, which helped let the Russian people deal with social issues as well as economic issues. And again, it's not going to solve the problem overnight, but it's going to at least show an attempt to reform and fix society. You'll see that now the emancipated serfs are going to start to work in the factories. Russia will start to look at coal and steel, and eventually that will definitely help Russia a lot in the world market. But again, bad working conditions, as we'll learn about the Industrial Revolution. Barely any working breaks. To work with coal is super dangerous for your lungs. And again, really super bad treatment for the peasants that now are working in the factories. You'll also see internal protests taking place. The young university students are going to be exposed to Enlightenment ideals, so they're going to fight for people's rights and freedoms. You'll also see a rise in anarchy, which again is this idea of no government. So the Tsar and the secret police will send out people to stop those protests and do some secret killings. There's a strong surge of Russian nationalism during this time, like what it is to be Russian. So you'll see that a lot of the territories that were taken under Russians were forced to speak Russian language. So this is kind of where you start to see the beginnings of hostilities that happened between Ukraine and Russia. Anybody that was Jewish was heavily persecuted during this time, so there was a lot of persecution happening to Jewish people. Again, there's that common knowledge where most people will associate bad treatment towards Jewish people in the Holocaust, but I want to remind you that if you were Jewish during this time in Russia, really horrible treatment happened to you. Alexander II, which was a Romanov, was actually killed by an explosive, so it just shows you how crazy things are in Russia. And the next successor will be Nicholas Romanov II, who is known to be kind of a weak leader. He will wage a war against Japan in 1905, and it will be a humiliating defeat again. The Japanese will be the first Asian nation in the world during this time to fight against a European power and win, and this is exactly the reason why the Japanese will be contenders in World War I and World War II. Last section for this part is Japan, the Meiji Restoration, also known as the Meiji era. During this time, you can see that under the Tokugawa dynasty, they start to have a massive decline in agriculture. The Tokugawa shogunate was taxing people heavily, especially the peasants, and major famines and crop failures took place to where it led to a lot of starvation. So during this time, Japan became super weak. The United States starts to cruise into Japan, and eventually what they'll do is a guy by the name of Commodore Matthew Perry will force the Japanese to open their ports under an unequal treaty called the Treaty of Kanagawa. The reason why the Japanese could not contest Commodore Matthew Perry is because they showed up with massive steel ships that the Japanese could not compete with. They gave them a choice. They said, hey, either you guys force to sign this treaty or we will cause a war. And so the Japanese definitely listened. You'll see that the Japanese will just take upon a policy of modernization and westernization during this time. They will learn as much as they can from the Europeans as well as the Americans, and they will change everything in their society. The Japanese during this time also had some problems with the samurai. If you remember, samurai are held as, a very important Japanese symbol in society, and ever since Tokugawa, the status of the samurai changed. So when Americans start to come in and foreigners start to come in, the samurai feel extremely betrayed as well as upset about the preservation of their culture. The samurai will make a last attempt to try to preserve their culture by having raids and fights against the government. Unfortunately, you know what's going to happen in that story. The emergence of what's called the Gatling gun, a type of machine gun, is created during this time. And unfortunately, all those years of training with the samurai sword are going to be lost to the Gatling gun. So you can imagine tons of samurai were slaughtered by the Japanese government that had now been trained in Western ideals. And so if you ever watch the movie The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise in it, you will see the battle of the last samurai in that particular scene. And again, it's a slaughterhouse. It's really sad, unfortunately. Lastly, the shoguns have really lost their power, and again, you're going to see for one of the first times in Japanese history, the emperor being restored with more power. His name is Mitsuhito, or Meiji, which means enlightened rule, and he will definitely follow suit of modernizing. That's the big thing for this particular slide. The top right is a picture of the American boats that are made out of steel, and the second picture below is a depiction from the Japanese perspective. As Japan modernizes, you'll see that they heavily send people to go study abroad in Europe and America. They will be highly fascinated with German and British economy, so they'll model their governments and constitutional monarchies after Europeans. They'll also have more voting rights that will take place, so suffrage for males, as well as create things like trains, steamships, telegraphs, tariffs, and even factories. Remember the silk factories, as that is a big thing for Asian markets. Last but not least, the society, you'll see a picture of a samurai on the left-hand side with a top knot. They will start to cut the top knots off and have new hairstyles that are more Western. You'll see females wearing European-style dresses with Western-style hairdos. The kimonos that were once worn by Japanese women will start to be ditched, and women will start wearing corsets as well as European dresses, as we mentioned. You'll start to see society having all kinds of things like steamships, bridges, horse carriages, and things that really mimic European-style society. The picture off to the far right you'll see is honoring some type of ceremony for probably military or a battle. So you'll see that they've adopted the Western dress for military. We can assume also that they've created all kinds of new weaponry and the Gatling gun, again, was used in order to kill off the samurai, and you'll bet that in the next talk about Japan, you'll start to hear them in World War I, and then, of course, we'll get to World War II as a major industrial power. The last two scenes that you're going to see are just paintings that show the heavy Western influence that comes into Japan. They will most likely try to use something like this on the AP exam because it just shows how an Asian country heavily westernized, and they love for the students to be able to see the changes that happen in this particular society and how you can see it through paintings or pictures. Thanks for listening.